All right. So yesterday we talked about the war between the Athenians and the Persians at Thermopylae. Today, our subject is going to be another war in ancient Greece, and it was the Trojan War. And so there's speculation surrounding the Trojan War, and people think that it may just be a myth. And then some people think that there's evidence suggesting that it was an actual war. So the article that we're reading today is going to discuss the evidence that people have to suggest it's a myth and the evidence that people have to suggest that it is a real event. Okay. So the first paragraph says, the story of the Trojan War bridges the history and mythology of ancient Greece. It has inspired the greatest writers of antiquity from Homer, Herodotus, and Sophocles to Virgil. The site of Troy was discovered in the 1800s in what is now Western Turkey. Since then, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that it was the capital of a kingdom. They believe that the city might have been destroyed around 1180 BC, about 3,200 years ago. The site may be the basis for the tales told by Homer some 400 years later in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, so when we're looking here, we have to figure out what is the most important subject. Here it's talking about the Trojan War, but the majority of the paragraph is actually about Troy. So Troy was discovered. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that it was the capital of a kingdom. They believe the city might have been destroyed, the city being Troy. The site being Troy might be the basis for the tales of tales told by Homer. Okay, so I wanted to go through that because I want you to understand that Troy was a subject, and the way that I know that is that it's indirectly referenced throughout the rest of the paragraph. So the majority of the paragraph is about Troy. What is the most important information that we find out about Troy? Well, we're going to say that this is the most important, and the reason why we're going to say that is because we want to know whether or not it's real or myth. And we know based on what we read yesterday or what we're going to read today, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and those are both myths. And so this ties us back to our title, real or myth. And so we don't know we don't have a why in the paragraph, so we're just going to do our hashtag with our subject and our what. So, Troy might be the basis of tales told by Homer. So we have our next subheading after this first paragraph. It says the narrative of the Trojan War. The narrative of the Trojan War. And so we know that a narrative is a story. And so as we're reading these three paragraphs here, we're going to be looking to see what is the story surrounding the Trojan War. Paragraph 2. The Trojan War was a conflict between the kingdoms of Troy and Mycenae in Greece. According to ancient stories, the war began after Queen Helen of Sparta was either kidnapped by Paris, a Trojan prince, or ran away with him. Helen's husband Menelaus, convinced his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, to lead an army to bring her back. They were joined by a group of Greek heroes and sailed to Troy with a fleet of more than 1,000 ships. The Greeks laid siege to Troy and demanded Helen's return. So if you ever heard the saying, the face that launched 1,000 ships, that is referring to Helen of Troy, because there is a myth or a story that a whole entire war was fought in order to get her back. Okay, and so that's what this whole entire paragraph is about. So the war, what happened? So the paragraph is about the war, the Trojan War. We want to like point an arrow so we can be like specific. The Trojan War began after the Queen Helen of Sparta was either kidnapped or ran away with a Trojan prince. So this is what happened. Excuse me, I put a question mark there. And this is also why. So what happened? War began. Why? Because Helen was either kidnapped or ran away with a Trojan prince. And that's what we're going to put in our hashtag. Trojan War began because Helen was kidnapped, and I'm going to put a slash here, meaning or ran away with Trojan prince. Moving right along to paragraph number 3. The war lasted more than 10 years. It ended after the Greek armies left a large wooden horse outside the gates of Troy. After much debate, the Trojans pulled the mysterious gift into the city. When night fell, the horse opened up. A group of Greek warriors, led by Odysseus, climbed out and destroyed Troy from within. Okay, so what happened here, or excuse me, the subject here is war. What happened is it ended. I'm going to put an exclamation point here. Why did it end? Group of Greek warriors climbed out of the wooden horse and destroyed Troy from within. So I'm going to make sure, again, that my hashtag reflects what I have in my symbols. And so I'm going to say Trojan War ended when Greeks ambushed Troy using a wooden horse. So all of the Greek soldiers were actually inside of the wooden horse, and they built this monument to Troy thinking that they would receive it as a gift and bring it inside of the gates, because back then all of the cities were surrounded by these large gates. And if you've ever seen a movie or a documentary, you know that they had like bridges, and that was the only way that you could enter into the city. And so there was one way in and typically one way out. And so they had to figure out a way to penetrate the gates. The way that they did that was with this wooden horse. And so they were able to infiltrate the city, and then they were able to go on ahead and ambush them from within the city gates. Okay. Paragraph 4. After the Trojan defeat, the Greek heroes slowly made their way home. Odysseus took 10 years to make the difficult journey home to Ithaca, as recounted in Odyssey. Helen, whose 2 Trojan husbands were killed during the war, returned to Sparta to reign with Menelaus, her husband. After his death, some sources say Helen was exiled to the island of Rhodes. A widow who lost her husband in the Trojan War had her hanged. Okay? So, this is about 2 people. It's about Odysseus, and then it's about Helen. Okay? So, basically, we want to figure out how we can tie those 2 together in a cohesive hashtag. So we're always thinking about like how we're going to write our hashtag. So the subject is what happened to them after the war. So this is the subject. It's like what happened after the war. And so after the war, 2 things happened. Odysseus took 10 years to get home, and Helen returned to Sparta to reign with her husband. Hey, And then a widow had her hanged. The reason why is because she lost her husband. So, hashtag is going to say, after war, or after the war, I'm going to say Odie, just going to short his name down to Odie. Took 10 years to get home. And Helen returned to Sparta and ruled until her husband died and she was hanged by a woman whose husband died in Trojan War. So that is what happened there. That is what happened there. So this is the narrative of the Trojan War. This is a story of how the whole war began, what happened during the war that ended it, and then what happened after the war. So we have before, during, and after, okay? All of that tying back to that title up there. So the next one that we have is the Trojan War epics. And so I asked you all to look up the definition of the word epic because it is a word that you need to know and understand in order to understand this section. So in parentheses next to the word, I put poem because an epic is a type of poem. And so Homer is going to be like a major person in Greek history because the Odyssey and the Iliad are both epic poems. So they're like really, really long poems about a hero's journey to accomplish something, okay? So when I think of epics, I automatically think of Homer. I think of poetry. So I'm going to read this and I want to figure out like, what are the Trojan War epics? Paragraph 5 says, little is known about the historical Homer. Historians think the Iliad was completed in 750 BC and the Odyssey in 725 BC. Both began as oral stories and were first written down decades or centuries after they were composed. Many of the most familiar episodes of the war, from the abduction of Helen to the Trojan horse and the destruction of Troy, come from the so-called epic cycle. These were narratives put together about 500 BC. So it's easy for me to look at this name and say, oh, this is about Homer. This is not about Homer, okay? This is about the Iliad and the Odyssey. I know this because it mentions Iliad and Odyssey. The next sentence then says both what? Both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is a second time that I'm seeing a reference to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then it says the episodes of the war come from the epic cycle, these narratives, which would be the Iliad and the Odyssey, excuse me. So I'm going to put a smiley face on these. Okay, well, what about them? They began as oral stories and were first written down after decades or centuries after they were composed. So this is going to be the what happened. Why did this happen? Is because they began as oral stories that they were not written down until decades or centuries after they were composed. So this is basically saying that they were passed down by word of mouth. So people would tell each other the stories, and that's how the stories were passed down. And then finally someone sat down and wrote the stories down. Okay? So our hashtag is going to say Odyssey and Iliad written down decades to centuries after they were created, because they began as oral stories. Okay. Paragraph 6. In the 1st century BC, the Roman poet Virgil composed the Aeneid. The book is the third great epic of the ancient world, inspired by the Trojan War. The Aeneid follows a group of Trojans led by the hero Aeneas. They leave their destroyed city, and after a series of adventures, they founded the city of Rome. Virgil's aim was partly to claim that Rome's first emperors were descended from gods and heroes. Okay? So this is about Aeneid, right? Like we see it in here twice, so we know that that is a subject because of the frequency with which we're seeing it. Well, what about the Aeneid? It is the third great epic inspired by the Trojan War. Why was it written? It was written to claim that Rome's first emperors were descended from gods and heroes. So we have our subject, or what happened, and our why. Aeneid, third epic, inspired by the Trojan War, and was written to claim that Rome's first emperors were ancestors of gods and heroes. Okay, so that is what's happening in that paragraph there. Now, we look at those first two sections. There is one final section here that you are going to read and annotate on your own. So we've done the first two large sections. This is the last one. You're going to read and annotate it on your own using symbols and hashtags. You're going to make sure that you're actually doing accurate symbols and accurate hashtags by looking for what is the subject, by determining what is the thing that is the most talked about, determining what's happening with the subject that's important, and then finally looking for the why. Now, I will say the why might not always be there. It might not always be apparent. And so sometimes you may not have a why. Okay, but I will be looking at your hashtags for 7, 8, 9, and 10, and I want you to make sure that you have an accurate subject and an accurate description of what is happening with that subject. After you do that, of course, you're going to go on ahead and complete the questions. All right, I will be around to check on you all in a little bit.